Okay, these are some more practice problems, and we have a whole bunch of these little mini equations, I like to call them. They're pretty easy. Now we're going to have a restricted domain, so we're going to go from 0 to 2 pi, including 0, not including 2 pi. And the first one is the sine of x equals 1/2. So we know the sine of x equals 1/2. First of all, we want to know what quadrant it's in. So this is positive. So the sine is positive. Remember, all students take calculus. So the sine is positive in these two quadrants. Okay? So I'm going to be in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. So the sine of x equal 1/2. This implies that x equals pi over 6. But we're also in quadrant 2, so we're in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2, so it'll be pi over 6 and 5 pi over 6. Okay, so those are my two quadrants where the sine equals positive. Okay, the next one, the cosine equals the square root of 2 over 2. So the cosine is positive, so the cosine is going to be positive in the first quadrant and the fourth quadrant. Now the cosine of x equals the square root of 2 over 2, that implies that x equals, and that was going to be my good old pi over 4. And that's positive in the first quadrant and also in the fourth quadrant, so this is going to be pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4. That's going to be 7 pi over 4. So those are the two values. Those are the two values where the cosine of x is positive, the square root of 2 over 2. Okay, the next one, the tangent of x equals negative 1. Well, the tangent of x equals 1 at pi over 4. Okay, but negative, it's going to be negative in these quadrants here, the second and the fourth. It's positive in these two quadrants, negative in these two quadrants. So this is going to imply that x will equal, so the tangent of pi over 4 is 1, but it's going to be negative in this quadrant, so that's going to be negative 3 pi over 4. And in this quadrant, which will be negative, 3 pi over 4, and it's also going to be negative 1 in this quadrant, okay, which will be 7 pi over 4. Okay, so these two quadrants here, 2 and 4. Okay, and the cosine of x equals negative the square root of 3 over 2. Okay, so the cosine of x equals the square root of 3 over 2 at pi over 6. But it's going to be negative in these two quadrants. So that's going to imply that x will equal. So this would be positive pi over 6, but this would be negative here and here. So negative 5 pi over 6 and 7 pi over 6. I'm sorry, not negative, I should say. 5 pi over 6 and 7 pi over 6 is where the cosine of x will be negative square root of 3 over 2. So again, we have 5 pi over 6 and 7 pi over 6. Okay. Okay, the next one, the sine of x equals negative 1/2. Well, again, we know the sine of x equals 1/2 at pi over 6. But it's going to be positive in these two quadrants, 1 and 2, so it's going to be negative in these two quadrants. So that's going to be 7 pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6. So this implies that x equals 7 pi over 6. That puts me in quadrant 3, and 11 pi over 6. That puts me in quadrant 4. So again, you have to know your basic first quadrant values. And again, we know the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. But then once we're in these two quadrants over here, it shifts it around to 7 pi and 11 pi over 6. Okay, the last one here are these mini equations. Okay, the tangent of x equals positive 1 over the square root of 3, so it's going to be in these two quadrants. Tangent is positive in the first and the third quadrant. And the tangent of x equals 1 over the square root of 3 when x equals pi over 6, so that's going to be pi over 6. Okay, and then also in this quadrant, and that's going to be not 5, but 7 pi over 6. So that's how we kind of handle those little mini equations. So you have to know your first quarter values, and then you have to know how to determine the quadrants. All students take calculus, and if it's positive, what quadrants it's positive in, and then what quadrants it's negative in, and then use the sign that you have to determine which quadrants you're talking about. Okay, I hope that helps.